Hey everyone, I've got a very exciting guest with me on the Svagat Show. The Svagat Show is where we highlight incredible folks from India doing incredible things in Europe. And today I've got Suryansh Chandra with me, who's had an amazing journey. I've gotten to know Suryansh over the last couple of months, and it's just been wonderful getting to know him. What a fantastic journey from being an architect at one of the top architecture houses in London to starting his own, or should I say, accidentally starting his own robotics company, which has gone on to raise close to $100 million. To then moving on from there and starting his own startup on around performance management, which is really interesting. And we'll dig deep into a bunch of these topics. So when I was talking to Suryansh around what should we talk about, should we talk about robotics? Should we talk about architecture? Should we talk about his current startup? We were brainstorming for a little while, and we arrived at the topic of bad managers. It's a topic that is close to, I guess, anybody who's worked in a company because it impacts all of us, and one would say, in some ways, the entire economy as well. So, thank you so much, Suryansh, for coming on to the show.
Thank you, Rajab. Thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, why don't you just sort of give a little background to how you ended up doing what you're doing.
Sure. Yeah, it's been I would say a career that started back in 2004. So over a trajectory in India, Delhi, NCR as an architect. So over the course of 20 years, it's gone from first freelancing in India. I was kind of one of those architects who was sort of more technologically inclined from the beginning. We were like I and a bunch of other few nerds were sort of like really on the computer bandwagon and CAD very early days. So technology in some sense always excited me personally much more because also its speed of iteration and stuff in architecture is like one project takes half a career. So technology just affords a faster iteration cycle, and I felt architecture was quite slow that way. So that was a sort of, let's say, an inner driving force that was always pulling me towards things where I could iterate faster, try ideas faster, get it out there and see whether this works or how to improve it. So that led me to coming to London to do this particular master's program at the Architectural Association. It's a school that only does architecture, and it's quite elite in just the architecture world, but that is not a big university. But it's a very unorthodox school of trying a lot of weird ideas that you would not get to try anywhere else in the world. And programming and the close combination of programming, computation, and architectural design was something that they were really exploring. So I was super interested in that just because I did not agree with what their architecture looked like, especially coming from an Indian context where architecture is very utilitarian and functional. In the European context, architecture is very, especially in a practice like that or in an elite school like that, it's very high end, very sophisticated and polished. So some of that didn't sit with me very well or aligned with me very well, but I was excited by the technological playing ground that it afforded. And that became a really good exploration. That was actually the first time in my career I ever worked in a large company. It was 400 people. Now I think they're close to 500 or 600 or so. But for an architecture studio, that's pretty large. Not from a tech startup standpoint, but from an architecture standpoint, that's huge. They are like top 1%, maybe in the 1% elite design boutique houses in the world. So there was the first time, I think, like when I was working in India, picking up something we were talking about earlier as well, I had the freedom and the comfort and, let's say, confidence to pursue whatever it is that interested me. But when I came to Europe, and especially after I finished my master's, I was tied by a visa. I was tied by financial constraints. So I really needed to look for a job. And Zaha was the most exciting place it could be. And working in a big structure was where I did face management for the first time, management, bureaucracy, politics. And this, I guess, not to just single out any one particular company, politics is a human phenomenon. When you put enough people in a room, there will be politics.
For people that are not from the architecture world, is Zaha Hadid like the McKinsey of architecture or the Goldman Sachs of architecture, like
Yeah,
Shalon?
you could say that it's very, very competitive to get in. It is a place that is, looked up to as a standard setter in the industry. So, I mean, the thing that differs from McKinsey or these kind of companies is the financial reward. It's not the same, but not even close on scale.
Yeah.
But it is still looked at as like, if you went to a good university, if you want to learn the best in the trade, that's where you go.
Which is interesting, right? Like in the last many years, we've seen a lot of wealth being created, right? Whether it's in India, Europe, US, of course. And we were discussing earlier how we wonder if a lot of this wealth is disproportionately distributed among certain industries. So you think about technology, you think about law, you think about finance, and ignored a lot of fields. What I mean, collectively, let's call them as the creative fields, right? Think about journalism, think about architecture, think about design houses. Um, and so one hears about things in general. You will hear people say things like, hey, just drop everything and study STEM courses, right? Because STEM courses are probably an inroad into these industries, right? And architecture, I guess, is sort of, at least from a skill perspective, at the intersection where there is a creative side to it, and there's also an analytical side to it because you're dealing with measurements and numbers. But it's also a very, I guess, like medicine, a very insular field, right?
So just speaking from a personal perspective, like thinking of myself as an ambitious person and the challenges I saw like, let's say, rising through the ranks in Zaha. But also I would say, like, others may not directly echo this, but from a distance I can see that their trajectories have been similar. People I've known closely in Zaha and outside in other design studios, which is when you get in, or when you're sort of out and you're hoping to get in, you have this very glamorous view of what it is, and then you get in, and for a while you're overwhelmed by the amount of just sheer talent in the room. It's incredible people from the most incredible universities and schools of thought working there. So that really was quite an exciting place to learn for the first few years. But after it, there's a level of comfort that started deciding, for me at least, that okay, I belong here. I'm not the newbie. I'm not the person who is not as skilled as the room. And at some point, I reached a place where it was like, I want to do more than what this place can offer. I want to go into technology. I want to write software. I want to build robots. I want to play with technology because that's really interesting me. And this place is kind of, let's say, as a business built around the practice of architecture, where there's a commission model, there's a construction project, and that is your primary revenue source. So in design houses, or particularly in architecture, this is a conventional model, and there's not much innovation that, at least in my time, I had seen around business model innovation within design practices. They would have the core business of architecture, but other than that, they might try to sell products or something, but it'll always be like a very ignored second line of business, which could be productized or scaled. So productification or scaling is not in the ethos of the industry in that sense. And
Yeah.
for me, the closer I was going to technology, I was like, this is the way to slowly build something long term and create value. Value is something I didn't think of in that sense back then in terms of money, but I thought of it as like exploring an interesting idea and really building it into a living product.
It's it's
Yeah.
really interesting that you say that, because like one of the things that's very common with creative industries is also that it's a very apprentice based model, right? And so you hear of a lot of stories where people are like, hey, you know what, you go through a rite of passage, learn from the best until you become your own thing, and then eventually maybe have your own studio, right? Like that's typically the process. But while you're going through that rite of passage, um it's a challenging time because you're obviously learning a lot, and there's these strong personalities that you have around,
Mhm.
And then at the same time, given the part around the business model, the compensation need not necessarily be even within that field, right? It's nothing compared to what you have in tech or finance. That's just sort of the case of where the profit pools are, right?
Mhm.
And so I'm also wondering that, somewhere when people enter this field, do they understand this trade-off, or is it like you just end up there and then you sort of figure out that, hey, is this what I really want to do?
It's a great question. I think most people who end up there have followed a linear trajectory after leaving school to go to architecture school and then maybe work a few years somewhere, then done a master's, then ended up here. So they've over time become more and more siloed within the realm of architecture. And this is something I find quite maybe constraining about architecture, in that they're very siloed, they're very insular. They only hang out with themselves and only talk to other architects. The office is 400 people and 90% of them are architects. And then there's some admin stuff. So it's like you don't have exposure to what is going on in the rest of the world. You kind of have a feeling you're in a very underpaid profession when you speak to your friends, but you don't know why. And so you just kind of carry this I don't know, intellectual view of looking at the world, that everything should be like, it's not it's very professorial in a way, like it's intellectual superiority or intellectual high ground rather than actual sort of monetary return for your work. You do it out of labor of love. You don't do it out of return for money or return for hours put in.
But as some of these things become larger, it's not necessarily that the person whose name is on the name of the company is the one that you're necessarily working with day in and day out. And thus comes managers and,
Exactly.
senior managers. I know we were talking about the importance of role models,
Mm-hmm.
stories.
Mm-hmm.
And like, my sense is that when you are in places like these, you need that inspiration to come down all the way across the board, right?
For sure. I think when I was working in Zaha, like Google was still seen as this kind of like miraculous work culture that almost was outside of this universe. And then we were working in this sort of architecture office, like gigantic architecture studio with very low pay, long hours. It's like known every famous design studio is like that. It was like, why are we doing this? We can also write code. We can also do that. We have the same technical skills as those guys. But why is it that this river just feels so much more upstream? I'm not just saying financially, I mean, creatively, it's very fulfilling. So that is something that very few other careers afford. And I think that is still why a lot of people stay there, because they really love that. But when you step out of that profession, you start to see this sort of thing that we are working very hard, and this is a very slow moving industry. And management per se, in that sense, good management, I found to be a luxury of the environment where you could afford it. In the Googles of the world, where there was stuff like Project Aristotle and these kind of creating psychological safety in your workplace, and you could pay expensive consultants to come and do this work for you. But when you're a design studio who doesn't have those kind of tech or product margins, training managers, getting expensive people to come in and teach and coach stuff is a luxury you cannot afford. So even in startups, like early stage startups, when they're cash strapped, coaches only come in, like coaching or these kind of consultancies is not something you do regularly. You do it only when you're in crisis. Like, yeah, sure, the founder starts something, but eventually the company grows so quickly and they make so much effort in hiring good managers, that is like there's this indoctrination of, here's the culture of the company, here's how we onboard you into it, here's the values we look at in behavior, whether this culture is what people stick to or not. This conscious culture creation is something that never happened in a design, or at least for the 6 years I was there, I was never, other than the design, there was almost no other culture that was particularly spoken about.
Could you walk through what were some of these contrasting things that you noticed between, say, a design studio and then when you were comparing that to a technology company, either your own startup, or what you're seeing now with your clients?
I left Zaha back in 2015, so it's been 9 years. So I'm sure that place has changed a lot since, in a good way. But back then, when the contrast that I had with the startup that we built, Automata, and every other startup that we learned from in terms of building good culture, there was a very conscious discussion which included employees as to this is where we need to get to, what are the social behavioral values that we should be showing up with to make this happen. And if you don't talk about it, people just mirror what the founder does, or sort of that behavior ripples through, and you start to see magnifications of your own worst traits within your company culture. So these kind of things become important because you care about an outcome, and you care about that outcome because you have a very limited runway. Design studios are not going to die in 8 months or in 6 months if they don't fundraise. So they just have the luxury of time in that sense as well, to not pay attention to these problems until they become big enough to be solved. Whereas in a startup, if you don't fix this, you're going to die. So it's much more mission critical. So things like, the culture of daily stand-ups, it was so simple. Or the weekly retrospective where everyone's messages on Slack, this is what I did this week. And then there's social stuff, and there's, going on offsites and stuff like this. This stuff was very consciously designed into the calendar of a company as culture building, as cohesive forces. Design studios don't have that. You show up for work, you do your work, and when you get a new project, you'll get a new brief. But there wasn't a ritualization like this of cultural practices, and there was no manager was just like, okay, I became a manager. That means now I've been around for a few years. I now have 4 people who I'm supposed to run to basically deliver this project in 4 weeks. But I have no idea what a one-to-one is. I don't know. I was never told by anyone to do a one-to-one with every person that reports to me. So there's no formal channel of feedback. There's no formal channel of communication. If you need a raise, you don't know who you should go ask. If you want feedback, you don't know. Like, there's no institutional mechanism to have that conversation.
Yeah. And so what got you to do what you're doing now?
It's interesting to start backwards there. It's a what we make is essentially a platform for feedback at scale, for companies to create a culture of feedback. So we create a platform where it becomes easy for people to give each other feedback, because it's almost like proactive signaling that we are looking for feedback. And then we try to fit it into the rituals of a company. How do you do better one-to-ones? How do you do better all hands at the end of the week, et cetera, and how do you make that feedback into actions? And this is coming from a very personal need of, when I was running Automata within the first, so I left back in 2020, we were about 60 headcount, and we'd raised about 15 million or so. So in that, like 3 or 4 years that we went from like 2 founders to 50, 60 headcount, there was so much it was exciting that we had so much momentum, so much capital, so much investors backing us, so much customer interest, and like a really good product trajectory. But the challenges of growing so quickly, like I knew in the back of I think most founders know this in the back of their heads, that they know they're getting in their way. They don't know how. You know that the best of you is multiplying, but also the worst of you is multiplying. So knowing how to stop the worst of you from multiplying is an exercise in self-awareness in some sense, because when you start to see your company echo your behavior, that's the first time it hits you really hard. Like, okay, if we are avoiding confrontation, the whole company is avoiding confrontation. If we are screaming at each other, that's normalizing that in the company. So whatever it is that we are doing is also echoing across the board. So that sort of led me to this thing that, okay, I'm extremely busy. I'm very thinly spread, and self-awareness just seems like a whole other project that I cannot pay attention to. It's like it requires coaching, it requires meditation, whatever, this other stuff, which I did like after and alongside as much as I could. But seeing that and knowing that when other people would like, often, like for me, the one-to-ones that I did with people were by far the most effective tool in learning how to become a better manager, because they would tell you stuff in those one-to-ones. They would sit with you, and they would be able to, especially if you are open to feedback, they would very willingly give it to you. But that is not scalable for a founder to go check in with every single person in the company. And some founders do this. There's like legendary examples of founders like taking 6 months to go around the whole company, speaking to every single person. And what that does is two things. It's giving you a deep temperature check of almost every aspect of your company very intimately. And the second thing it's doing is it's giving you a lot of feedback on how you could be better. And that is the exercise of collecting or asking for people about you at scale. So for me, it was like when I was running the company, I wanted to put anonymous letterboxes in the loo for people to drop chits at each other if they wanted to say anything. And I was like, when I come to you and ask you, you have stuff to say. But when I don't ask, you don't say anything. But this knowledge is super valuable for me to know. So can there be a system to pick this up at scale? So that was the inspiration for this. And like tracing it back further in my career, I very actively tried to be a better manager, a better leader. I was super interested in self-development through that route. Because I was not, I think, coming at it from a place of insecurity that I'm insufficient. I was like, yeah, sure, I know I'm insufficient. Let me figure out how to get better. But if I trace it back, like if I was a manager in Zaha, or if I was a manager where I was slightly more insecure, I was on a visa, I was financially constrained, I may try to overlook my shortcomings. I may try to pretend that I'm the perfect manager, and then try to be not consciously, but at least like play defensive, play aggressive, like defend my boundary, defend territory, get threatened by people who are my juniors who are maybe starting to compete with me or something. So
Yeah.
this stuff happens a lot when I think managers come from a place of insecurity.
Yeah, that's something that I've seen as well. I was talking to a bunch of friends, in different places, right, in the US and in Europe and India, and I was asking them that, what was your experience with your managers? In some cases, they are managers themselves, and it was interesting to find out how different people think about management. One is that, you're not taught anywhere. There is no course for it. You have to actively develop, and often you're just thrust into that role,
Mhm.
and you're supposed to be really good at it from day one, but you've not had any training on that topic, right? And on top of that, if you add things like your visa situation, and so I was very surprised to hear that immigration is one of the factors which in some ways affects what kind of a manager you become. I found it very strange. I was talking to a friend who was on an H-1B,
Mhm.
and then another one who was on the Tier 2 visa here in the UK, and they were saying something along the lines of, well, I need this job more than a citizen. And so it's really important for me to do really well. And if that comes sometimes at the cost of taking more credit, I will probably do that because I really need to grow, because my immigration depends on it. I cannot afford to lose this job, which I thought was very interesting and not something that's often spoken about much, because it just seems like such a random thing. But
Yeah.
the more you think about it, you're like, yeah, okay. I mean, it's not right, but I see why they are behaving in a certain way. Um, and so that's really interesting. What do you make of, like, now that you've been running this company, observing a lot of organizations? Uh, what are your thoughts on what makes for good, but more importantly, what makes for horrible managers? We've all had them. What have you noticed? Because now you're for the first time observing it from an external lens.
Yeah, for sure. In general, I think managers are like you very correctly said, and it's something that really is so bizarre in this world that we managers are still not taught in any sense, and whatever training exists is in a vacuum or isolation, not in on ground. There are executive coaches and stuff, and that's why that industry is somewhat booming and it's very expensive. But like when your company can afford to pay for it, then you should get in the right guys. But on the side of like the way most people become managers in a company is you stay in for a certain while, you start to get good at what you're doing, and then you start to have people start to believe in you that, oh, you should be given additional resources because you're really capable. a lot of people come at it from an IC lens. They were really good ICs. They're very good in the trenches. They're very good at numbers. They're like salespeople are often like that. But exceptional engineers are like that. Some in every industry, right? Operations as well. And when these people start to become managers, most of them are like, nobody's as good as me. I'm the best at doing what I do. So they have this sort of, I don't know, almost like an aversion to like, oh, taking more people on is going to slow me down. And I can execute faster. This is how I thought, and sometimes I still find myself falling back into that trap. And when you have to essentially be a good manager, you have to think about nurturing people. You have to think about how can I make that person be the best version of themselves, not just deliver to this deadline by this day. But if you want to be a sustainable manager, you want your people to be happy and you want to make them better than what they came in with. So you want to essentially be a multiplier or like a really great teacher or mentor who takes somebody and shapes them into something that even they didn't believe they could become. But that's a long game. It's not something that can be proven in 3 months, 6 months. But as a manager, you have to start delivering immediately. So this balance of like, how do I make you grind, put you to the grind right now so that you can deliver this next thing versus give you the time to grow and expand in the direction you want to grow is extremely tricky. Management is not an easy job. It's like being a parent to like so many people at the same time. And they're all adults. And you control their salary, you control their job title, you control where they go in the company, what they get to work on. So it's a lot of responsibility from that perspective. So definitely not an easy job. And the hardest thing is that most people come at it without any training, just get promoted into it and hope that miraculously it works. And in a few years, if it doesn't work, we'll put you back on an IC track. If it works, we'll put you on this one. So I think like for me, what I had to learn the most was like, for me, the idea of work is to sit at a computer and do stuff. It is not to walk the corridors. It is not to talk to people and chat around. And for a manager to get that flavor in the room or read the room in that sense is super important. So like what happens by the water cooler conversation or what happens casually in the corridor while people are talking, like that kind of stuff gives you a temperature check of what's happening in the room. And the best managers that I have seen do that a lot. The best managers and the best leaders go talk to people, not sit at a desk and churn output.
Somewhere you need to be fairly secure by yourself, right? To be able to do that, because I can totally understand where you've been a top performer and now suddenly you have to manage 3 people. It's one way where you try to now like take 2 examples, right? In one case the person really wants to put in the effort, and in the other case they just don't even care and they're like, hey, I'm only doing this because I'm getting a title bump and I have a salary. So in the second case, sure, they might play the politics, and we'll go deeper into that. But in the first case, where they genuinely want to help as well, often you notice that the way they try to do that is by micromanaging, right? They're saying that, hey, well, I was a rock star person and I did ABC. If you do ABC, you will also become a rock star person, and then hopefully you will also grow. Like you've seen a lot of people that approach management from that lens, right? Like if I literally just create a clone of me, right, and then we'll have 2 of us, and everybody will look great.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a very, very, very common thing to like. My journey was like this, therefore your journey should also be like this.
What's wrong with that? What's the problem? That sounds good in theory.
Yeah, exactly. But my coach used to say this, like there are people who you should think of as plus ones, and then there are people who you should think of as multipliers, that they will take a few things and multiply. But you need a good balance of the people who add versus the people who multiply. If you have only multipliers in the room, you'll end up with 0 because there's no ones. It's not that a certain personality type is more suited to be a manager. I think that's there is a myth around that as well, which is like if you're empathetically more aware, good with people, etc., you will become a better man. As long as you're not a douchebag in general, you can make a good manager, and just don't be a douchebag to the people. So things about you that you lack. So some managers who lack technical skill, are managers to like very technically sophisticated people. They may have a certain insecurity, but it is not their job to be technically as good as those people. So I think the moment a manager realizes that you don't have to be superior to the person that you're managing, you have to make them the best at what they are, and you be the best at what you are. And that is a non-overlapping skill. That's like, find a way that complements.
Let's
And
let's go into examples of how people can be douchebags. What have you seen? How are people douchebags?
uh, like I have having extremely high standards or having very fixed ways of doing things, that this is the only way this thing can be done because this is the way I know. And regardless of what you know or where you come from. So that sort of rigidity. So in my own case, I think the way I faced bad management was often when I felt like, even though whatever it is that I'm doing is coming from a technically more educated place than what my manager understands, it is going to be shot down, and we're going to have to do the manager's way because that is the only way he understands or she understands. So there were, or sometimes these kind of unexplained, like, this is getting into more political stuff, but sometimes, like, a big example of bad management is being thrown into bad projects uh, that even your manager doesn't want to touch, but you get put into it because you're the spare wheel in this case. So so these kind of things where you can clearly see like your manager is actively shutting you down into giving you the worst kind of shit to deal with, or just seeing you as like spare labor rather
Yeah.
than somebody to be utilized and made to thrive in a way.
Yeah. One of the things I've noticed is where people confuse performance with feedback. Like performance is something you do at the end of the year or maybe twice a year where you say, hey, this is where you stand. But then feedback is like, hey, I really want you to improve. This is what I noticed. And often people just sort of mix the two. And so people end up getting like this really mishmash experience of what they think is feedback. And like as a manager, sometimes you have, and I've been guilty of this as well, where you're like, hey, you know what's the point of celebrating the good stuff, right? I only want to improve because that's what life is about, right? Like growing up in India, for example, where it's so competitive, you're never told about things that you do well. You're told about things that you can improve, and that comes with a certain harsh reality. Like, hey, you know what? That other person did something better, or like you're at 99%, you need to go to 99.5%. We've all heard about tiger moms in Southeast Asia. Not very different from how Indian parents are. That's the other thing that I've noticed as well, where feedback is not like feedback is supposed to be balanced, right? Like otherwise, like the person you're giving that feedback to gets so demoralized where they're like, why the hell am I even doing this stuff, right? I'm anyway spending like whatever, right, 70% of my waking hours in the office. Like, why am I even tolerating this shit? Uh, Especially from a manager who's like maybe 1 year older than me, like which you see a lot in technology and finance and some of these high growth fast-paced careers, right? So
Yeah, true. It's not celebrating enough, or I think that you brought up something very interesting, which is about like in India with the competition that you're used to, and I think also there's like maybe a cultural bias too. Appreciation is harder to come by. Criticism is much easier to come by, and we are very hard driving like that. It's competitive. We're used to working our asses off, and we're used to calling each other out on stuff that doesn't work. Appreciation happens once in a while when we actually do celebrate.
yeah.
Uh, and I find that is like, yeah, that's a sin I've committed a number of times. Just like one goal achieved. Okay, what's the next one? I can already see the next fire burning. Let's run to that. Who has time to celebrate? And I do that on myself all the time. It's still. So I personally also struggle with it. And I think that is cultural.
Yeah.
I
Is that something that you've seen uh, done differently in other cultures?
um if I think of my like Indian friends, mostly like even work friends, I think it's easier uh, to say harsh things about each other's work or about each other generally. Like they're just much more. There's this attitude of going straight at it, uh, and whereas with other European founders or even employees, it's like generally there's like a more I find emotionally a more gentler approach needed. Like I think the British are very good at being very, sophisticatedly gentle, but still message.
All right. Yeah. Yeah.
So, so when I think like that was like one of the early learnings for me in my career here when I shifted is like, oh, don't say direct shit. Like really, really, the less you say it, the better it is for you. Like you should say it, but find the right way to say it. And sometimes I'm still guilty of like maybe going too direct at it, like especially giving like you said, feedback versus performance management, and those conversations are often hard. And you want to say harsh things, but not say like this. I'm not firing you, but I'm just saying this because I want to improve. I want you to improve on this, and that can be a very um, difficult message to deliver in the right tone.
Yeah. Yeah. And so how do young people who have just become managers for the first time, like what is the kind of training that they go through or should go through? And I'll just sort of put in a bit of context. um, I've noticed how a lot of times young managers tend to be really bad because they are also figuring this out. And then by the time they become really senior, they figure by dilly-dallying and trial and error, they figure out. So by the time they're like 50 years old and a senior vice president and they're still around, they've figured out what makes for. But that those first 5 6 years,
Mhm.
like if you're unlucky enough to be a reportee to them, it can be a horrible experience for the person that's reporting, right? Because they might be insecure, they might not even know. And like I know in a lot of companies they have things like these training programs, and the person who's just become a manager is like, I don't need this, or like this is a waste of time. Many ways the way people think about like really important things, right? Like for example, sexual harassment training in companies, right? Like nobody's really looking forward to attend those. It's like a compliance thing, like, yeah, I gotta go for that, you know
Mm.
prevention of sexual harassment training because I'm a manager. But like, yeah, I'm not really looking forward to it. It's just a checkbox that I have to do. I feel like a lot of managers also tend to treat this stuff with
Like,
the same level of disregard.
yeah,
uh,
for sure. Coaching, like for me, I actively started looking for executive coaches, I think 2 or 3 years into founding. And I think back then I was one of the rare founders who was doing that, me and my co-founder. Now it's become much more common. Uh, I think partly because investors are also starting to push for like, we are starting to see a lot of founders burn out and do like end up in places mentally where it's not healthy for them to be. So things that you struggle with in life and you have no answers for, you're like, I don't know how to get out of this. This is just like giving me a lot of sleepless nights. If you're a nice person, you will struggle with holding ground, holding people accountable. If you're a harsh person, you will struggle with keeping people around. If you're, and most managers, for example, when they start, they don't pay attention to this stuff because they're still ICs. They have to deliver to a goal. They have that job still to be done. So they're driven by that they know all the fires there. Like, I still have to write this software or ship this update or whatever, do this particular customer ticket. Whatever that is, as if that is still your core KPI by which you're being measured, you're not being measured on how good as a manager you are. You're being measured by the number on the spreadsheet. So I think that's why this stuff, just because it doesn't get measured and there's no easy way to for anyone to qualitatively assess if somebody is a good manager or not, except like word of mouth by of the reportees. This stuff is soft. It doesn't get measured. So there's no incentivization other than like legal stuff that, oh, I have to do sexual harassment training because that's a legal requirement.
But doesn't every company have now like a 360-degree feedback and tools like Lattice and all of these things, right? And so somewhere if that comes out as bad, then you might face some repercussions, at least in theory, right? Like, is that not a deterrent enough? Or no, it doesn't really, like, how does it work out in practice?
If you're delivering the number, nobody cares if you're a shit manager.
Yeah.
This
It,
is
it's a bit like how in finance, as long as you're showing returns, people don't really care if you've committed a crime. It's
yeah,
only when people lose money is when people go to jail.
yeah.
It's really interesting the parallels, but yeah, please go ahead. Yeah,
No, Uber's famous story, right? Like this, the world is full of founders who will go through walls and break stuff. Culturally horrible people around them, like for generations, decades, whatever. That this person isn't the best human being to have around, but is so exceptionally driven, will break through anything and will deliver the result. So we keep them around.
yeah.
So
And that's
in
what makes for great stories, right? Like that person against all odds went ahead and
yeah,
did that thing. That's much more exciting to hear than, yeah, well, he was a great creator of talent and nurtured them, and then they, steadily grew through the years.
there are companies also like that, right? Like when they become like that, it's not the founder that becomes known, but those companies become ecosystems of growth, like
Yeah,
Google, whatever,
yeah.
where you could hear
Or
that
even
the
even companies like GE, right? Like who have known to have like a really strong sort of leadership development program and manage that.
exactly. You
Yeah,
don't create a pyramid where the top is successful. You create a forest where everything is successful. Like everything that comes in ultimately becomes big and grows into something. And I think good management can make most companies into that, but the business model has to support growing into a forest rather than a pyramid.
yeah,
And that startups are like that, where like the growth is so quick, and the exploration of new territory and the willingness to go into new territories is so good that good you want to have people around and keep them for long and make them grow into something. Whereas in a pyramidal architecture practice, it's like, this is the maximum number of people we can promote this year. Anybody more? Sorry, there's no space.
There's this interesting quote that I came across from his name is John Boyd. He's a military strategist, was involved with the Pentagon for many years. I think led to the development of the F-16 fighter jet. And he had this quote, and I'm paraphrasing because it was a longer quote, but in a nutshell, what it said was, you can either be somebody or you can either do something.
Yeah.
And I thought it was really interesting, where essentially, at least what I understood it was that um, there's sometimes a dichotomy in the decisions that you take as a manager, as a leader, of course, but as a manager, where you might do something which might be good for your career and you might grow faster, and that might be odds with you doing certain things which might be good for the work that you're doing, but it might not necessarily lead to career growth as quickly, right? And we've all heard stories of how in certain companies you would hear, yeah, you know what, that guy became the vice president at Google, but he was really not the best person. He just took the credit of everyone and then grew quickly, and it was just like one failure upon another, but just kept on getting promoted. And then you'll have the other person who will be like the wild old sage in the company, where that person has been there from the beginning. They have mentored thousands of people. They have done a really great job, but like they're still somewhere. I mean, the prime example is if you've seen The Dark Knight, right? So Morgan Freeman's role, if you think about it, right, where he's like the person who did something, he was on the board, right? And now he's been shoved into some corner, just counting the spider webs and stuff, right? Like, is that something that you think about?
So this stuff is exactly why I think that what I'm doing now is so relevant, because it's exactly this sort of pattern behavior that we all know exists in the world. Like these patterns of certain people more credit hungry or more driven towards individual recognition rather than the collective cause. These are stereotypes. They exist in society everywhere. Companies, movies, families, etc. So they exist, but we all know about them through anecdotes. There's never any like actual measurement in that sense of like, here's how the chemistry is working, and here's a map of like a heat map of good stuff and bad stuff. That's what we're doing, with the hope that many of these patterns people can recognize it in themselves before they walk the path, that this is the path I'm on and this is where it's likely to go, and this is not the person I want to be. I don't think most people inherently want to be selfish. everything I've learned about psychology in the last 3 years, it's like most people want to thrive in life, but they only thrive when they feel safe. And when your safety is threatened, then you turn into an animal. So it's like whether it's visa, money, for if any reason, if you're feeling insecure in what you're doing, if something is attacking your core sense of like identity or protection or safety, that you will lose this job or you will lose something, then you will do a lot to defend yourself. But if you're feeling safe, you will want yourself to thrive and everybody else around you to thrive. So that is psychological work, right? That's not like a
Is
certain
it
thing not make
is
you
it
feel.
possible to feel safe in the workplace today? And are we really expecting too much from the workplace, right? Because I know that we were discussing this a while back, where, for example, if I look at the Gen Z, uh,
Mm.
who have already entered the workforce, right? I remember this, incredible talk that Simon Sinek gave, where he was talking about, back in the day, if you think about our parents' generation, work was just a place where you were expected to be loyal, do your work on time, and then you got loyalty from your employer in terms of a pension and whatever. And like, you had your family, your spouse for emotional support, your family for that. You had religion to go to, which gave you spiritual support, church, temples, whatever. And work was just one another part of that, right? Fast forward to today, it's hard to hold a decent relationship for more than a few months. People are questioning institutions like marriage. People are staying away from family, often, nuclear families by yourself. And so, somewhere, all of that emotional support that you used to get from other places, in life, is all now falling on your employer. And you think of places, times like the pandemic, where they're also supposed to be like your emotional support, and now all of that is just sort of coming in and falling on, the companies, and in many ways the manager's head. And on top of that, there is very little loyalty, given that you have layoffs left, right, and center. It's a very proven thing where, the best way to get a raise is to have a competing offer.
Mhm.
Rather than ask nicely, you just come with an offer which is like 2x of what you're getting. You're likely to get a raise. So, I mean, in that kind of an environment, um, I'm just trying to sort of balance that with what you were saying, which is, if you're secure, you're going to, like, I get all of that, but like, is that even possible? Like,
Exactly.
does that world even exist anymore? And so, is it really just about survival, in a jungle, or
Yeah.
are there other
Yeah,
alternatives?
I think it's not like a one constant state of permanent safety. There will be phases of safety, and there will be phases like if you're sailing a ship, like running a company is like sailing a big ship with lots of people, and the situation of the world is like the weather in the sea, right? Like if the sea is turbulent, there's no fucking way you can be safe. Like everybody is going to sink. So, but when the sea is smooth, you can do your best to create safety and not scream around the ship that, hey, we're sinking, we're sinking. There's this artificial panic that you're creating just because you are a panic wartime CEO, or you survive in panic. So it is that balance where I feel like some people, and this is also psychologically known, like some people just naturally thrive in more aggressive environments or more panic driven sort of states, because that's where they are, who they are. And too much comfort or too much safety makes some people uncomfortable. So in that sense, I think those kind of tendencies should be checked. But to say that, no, this job is going to last you the next 20 years, when I don't know if I have money for more than 12 months in the company's account, that safety is not possible at all. But to like, in that sense, to be as responsible as possible, in that if you're going to run out of money, don't tell the people 2 weeks before you're going to file for bankruptcy that sorry guys, you have to leave. Like, there's some human to human relationships can create safety regardless of circumstances, which is trust. If I can trust you, no matter how fast you're riding the motorcycle that I'm sitting on, if I trust you, I know that if something bad's going to happen, you will give me enough chance to escape or get out safely. So as long as there is that trust, as long as I don't fear that this guy is going to throw me under the bus, so I should constantly keep a lookout. That is what creates unsafety, and that's a human attitude, right? And that's what I'm saying. When times are panicked, people are more likely to throw each other under the bus. And that shows character to some extent. Like some people will just delay that decision longer. Some people will be too eager to run for the exit.
And so when you talk to either founders or the HR department, as I would imagine, as you're talking about your product, like what's the kind of conversations that you end up having, or like what is their expectation from this? Would love to learn about that.
Sure. It's mostly around the thing I tried to actually deploy in companies is not a product, but the cultural change of feedback. And particularly in the British context, feedback is an issue, culturally an issue. People don't say things to each other. People sometimes too nice to each other, even though saying some things at the right time would actually make a significant difference. And I'm seeing a multitude of this, which is not all managers will receive it the same way. Some will say this will destroy all the safety I have built in my team, because sometimes they want to protect their team from outside influences and from knowing how the rest of the company thinks about them, for example, because they're in a difficult place or something. The sea is choppy, let's say. But sometimes they, like when the team is doing well or when they're thriving, they take it quite with open arms, like, yes, please come do this because we want to proactively work out how we can improve team chemistry. But when team chemistry is already tricky and challenging and everybody is kind of walking on eggshells, then they sometimes can be two approaches. They can see it as, oh, this is going to destroy everything, or this is actually going to diagnose the issue and get me to work. So it's really across the spectrum. But I also feel like managers themselves have to be in a safe enough place psychologically to accept that they're going to get feedback at scale from their team and maybe from other managers in the business. So if the managers themselves are not in a place of psychological safety, then I'm finding that this is not the best time to approach them.
How does one assess that?
Their feedback says it very quickly. It's like because the tool is very in some sense very numerical. So it doesn't hide like in performance management systems, but behind loads of textual jargon, which you have to read to come to an insight. It's very numerical. So you can't really hide behind words anymore. It's all out there as a singular picture. So for some people, that can be really confrontational to look at. Like, I don't want to know this. I don't want to see this. I can't see what good comes out of this. Like, it's almost like an emotional fear response.
Yeah. Often when companies take up, I remember in my previous organizations, we used to use some of these tools, or at least a variation of this around pulse surveys and stuff like that you might have heard of. And obviously your sort of the initial reason to do that is for the CEO to know, hey, is everything okay? Is the health okay? And then the aim is to always think about improvement. So you enter it with a very positive sense that, hey, this will improve things. But sometimes it can also lead to some hard decisions, right? Any experience with that you've seen with companies where they've had to take some hard decisions basis the data that they saw?
For sure. This is a few actually. So in some places, like I can speak to an example of this is not a very big company. It was like a 25 people startup where I was running this as a consultant before we had a product. And so we went in to kind of just do this as a, like, the nice thing about it is that the whole team comes together for half an hour and the exercise is done. So it doesn't take any like long days of managers filling forms, etc. And then it produces this report where every single person gets to see where they were pegging themselves versus how the team sees them on like a certain number of dimensions. So you get a good sense of self-awareness, self-check, calibration in that. Are you a good communicator? Are you actually a trustworthy colleague? Are you collaborating well with others, etc.? Like these few dimensions. So if you rate yourself like really high on everything, you must be really good, or you must have a really good self-impression. And if you get like, I don't know, like jacked by it from every direction in the company, and you are the one person who is like so drastically off the scale. and you're a leader in the business, that becomes scary. It's like it. So the system actually effectively in half an hour of gathering collective opinion about a company can weed out these things, which maybe internally were already known for a long time, but not acknowledged. And there was no paper trail, so to speak, as to like, how do you put a finger on that this person is not liked by any of the people that they report to, that report to them, or any of the people they work with. And now finally everyone has a say, and the say is like, this person is not really hitting the mark on many things across, and they believe they are, and they believe they're doing exceptionally well. So
Yeah.
how do you, like, what do you do there? So this person basically had a tough conversation the day after we ran this exercise. The engineering team wrote a really long letter to the CEO saying, this person should go. And then 2 days later, that person was let go. So
Was this like a senior leader?
yeah, this was a C-level person in the business.
Wow. Yeah, but I guess I feel like maybe the company was still better off taking that decision, given that, the it I mean, as a leader, obviously you need your team to sort of, look up to you, and we want to be led by you as well, right? So
Yeah. This person was not the CEO. The CEO took the call of letting go, of making that person leave.
yeah,
He was still C-suite.
yeah, yeah. Interesting. Uh, wow. Anything else that you've noticed that's been interesting or been playing on your mind around this?
Yeah, I think a lot of the feedback from the managers that I'm getting is around this thing of this stuff is things I've been running my team for a year, so I kind of anecdotally know that this is how I feel. Like, I've been wanting this person to get a promotion forever, but I cannot make the case for them because they're not very visible outside the team. And now suddenly I have data. It's not just my opinion anymore. It's backed by 20 other people in the team to do this. And the same with weeding out douchebags, which is like, this person is a douchebag. Everyone knows. I don't know why they stick around in the company, or I don't know how they survive, but they just please the right people. They get called out very, very quickly with this. So in that sense, this is more of a system of feedback, like the letterboxes in the loo, which is like, tell me stuff that helps me improve. This is not necessarily a measure of my delivery that is happening on a different spreadsheet where you measure how much revenue I got this quarter or whatever. That is the stuff that should decide my promotion, not how to make me a better colleague.
Yeah. Okay. So two things that I want you to do. One is uh, look straight into the camera and address a young manager who is about to become a manager. They're a rock star. I see they're about to become a manager. They're very, very smart, but they just don't see the point of all of this. They're like, it's just a waste of time. If somebody's
Mm.
smart, they'll figure it out. You know the kind I'm talking about, right? And so like, just look into the camera, and what's the advice you want to give them?
Great question. So I think, like, I'm now about, like, early 40s. So 20 years ago, when I was early in my career, and I think even now, the one piece of wisdom that has really struck true is, the older you get, the less you try to do. The younger you are, the more desperate you are to prove yourself, and you try extremely hard. And the older you get, you just relax around knowing what you're good at, and you just do that. So any advice to, like, young managers is, don't feel threatened by the people who report to you. If they're good, if they're better than you, that's a great thing that you're getting to manage people who are better than you. Recognize what your gift in that is. Don't try to compete with them. Don't try to feel threatened with them. Try to multiply them. I don't know how, like, there's not one size fits all template to how to do that. Depends on who you are, what your natural tendencies are, what you're naturally gifted at. But really tune into what you are naturally gifted at and figure out how you can channel that to bringing out the best in others that work for you.
Well, you heard it here, guys. Thank you so much, Suryansh. Really appreciate for all the wisdom and the banter. Thank you, and wish you all the best.
Thank you, Rishabh.